What we talk about at Mercedes-Benz high power charging is that charging should not be the focus. It's what you do while you charge. So it's about lowering inconvenience time and giving time back to people so that they can spend it having that great cup of coffee or having that conversation, whatever they like to do for 15 to 20 minutes. But fast forward again, and about 2.5, 3 years ago, we said, enough is enough. We do have a brand that represents something, and we want to extend that brand promise into the industry, bring together the pieces, and help build what will be the most elevated charging network in North America. And as you said, most importantly, open to every single driver. We need to put charging in the ground at a level of quality and experience such that we can support EV adoption. I mean, that is our goal. I always say that, I joined Mercedes-Benz because, there is this history and legacy of being the first and the standards we've created over time. And now as we think about the future, being humbly able to help out on some of these large standing challenges to move the industry forward, that's the goal. That's what we're trying to solve. Hello, this is Andrew Cornelia. I'm the CEO of Mercedes-Benz High Power Charging, and this is Cars and Culture with Jason Stein.
Wonderful to have Andrew on the program to at least again unplug some of the myths about plugging in your vehicle. It's great to have you on. Welcome in.
Jason, thanks for having us.
I want to start with an article that was in Fortune that I saw that I believe had your name associated with it. And there's an interesting notion that I think will set the table for our conversation today. And it's a phrase that I wasn't aware of before. Much has been said and written about the death of the third place. I didn't know what the third place was. You explained it extremely well. Tell us today about the third place and how that relates to what you do on a regular basis.
Jason, I think it's probably important to start with what the first and the second place are.
Yeah, that too.
The first place is, simply where we live. The second place is where we work. And I think, as a community, those are the two predominant locations where we spend time. During COVID, what we saw was actually, the first and second place really converged into one. And we were, predominantly spending time in one location and not getting the same community interaction that we have in the past. And, this notion of the death of the third place is really about, kind of the evolution of our economy, which is, digitization. It is moving online, and it's really abandoning some of those physical locations that we had spent time at before. I mean, for our, parents' generation, it was the VFW hall. For, other generations, it's, the library, or the coffee shop, college campus. So, that's the third place is, how do we find somewhere where we can commune outside of home and workplace?
Third place is where, as you write, you mingle. You start a conversation. I mean, it used to be things that happened at baggage claim, but anymore, everyone's, as you said, staring at a device that's in their hand. So how does the third place and the technical evolution relate to EV charging?
Yeah, I'll tell you a story, Jason. I think this is, a good anecdote to highlight, why EV charging can be considered a third place. So, I lived in California for many years in the Bay Area, and one of my favorite routes in my electric vehicle was to drive up to Tahoe. And on that route, there's a charging station in a town called Truckee. And during one of those stops, I ended up actually meeting someone while the two of us were charging. He was driving a Buc-ee, I was driving a Tesla. We struck up a conversation over about 20 minutes, shared our experiences in the EV charging world, but developed a friendship. And, over the years, that friendship has, blossomed. It's become, a real bond. And, those are the opportunities serendipitously that exist around charging. So, we say that, there's kind of two critical problems to solve within the charging industry. One is we have to make sure that charging works every single time. It's critical infrastructure, and like a bridge or a road, you got to make sure that it works to a level of quality and satisfaction. But on the third place side, what we talk about at Mercedes-Benz high power charging is that charging should not be the focus. It's what you do while you charge. So it's about lowering inconvenience time and giving time back to people so that they can spend it having that great cup of coffee or having that conversation, whatever they like to do for 15 to 20 minutes.
And if you get it right, you can transform, as you say, the actual active charging, which is lives somewhere in most folks' minds as an obstacle. Still, we'll get to that, and change the actual active charging from a detour to a destination. It sounds awfully romantic, like the automobile, doesn't it?
I go back to my childhood, Jason, and I think about the Great American Road Trip, right? And I think about, these, trips with my parents and my brothers and, driving and stopping. And again, as you said, it not being a chore, but part of that memory. And I think, for Americans in large part with electric vehicles, that freedom of travel is being taken away when you don't have quality infrastructure. So what we're looking to do, as you said, is return that destination versus detour back to that Great American Road Trip, back to people's vernacular of what it means to own a vehicle.
Is there still a problem that persists in people's minds related to the perception of what's easy, accessible, a quality experience? It's still an issue, isn't it, Andrew?
The short answer is yes. Today, 1 in 4 chargers do not work the way they should. And across some networks, it's honestly a 50-50, toss up, whether or not you're going to show up at a charger and it works, meaning that you can plug in, you can get a charge, authenticate a payment, and walk away and have that great, cup of coffee or that great amenity.
Yeah. So Mercedes-Benz on this mission is putting $1 billion into a North American charging network. And it's obviously, you've said this in many other venues, but it bears repeating. This is not just for Mercedes-Benz. It is an approach to public charging that is accessible and that creates these experiences. How long ago did this journey start in Stuttgart, and why did it start?
Probably, if you want to start at the beginning, it started 138 years ago. And I'm somewhat, joking, but I know you had Dimitri and Melody on the podcast, and they talked about the heritage of Mercedes-Benz, but it really did start there. If you think about what Mercedes-Benz has represented within the automotive industry, we have been the first. We have been a leader. We have helped create standards for what automotive and mobility mean to the driver. So if you think about where we are today, and over the last, let's call it 15 years, as EVs have become part of the vernacular, we have really gone from selling a car to selling an experience, whether that's, an ownership experience that carries outside the door of the dealership, whether that's, a software enabled experience. It's not just about, the 4 doors and the 4 wheels. It's really about a digitized and an electric product and service that we're selling. So, now go back about 5 years, Jason, and the conversation around charging started within the Mercedes-Benz headquarters, which was, this challenge that we have in front of us around quality, reliable, experiential infrastructure is not being solved to the level of quality and the degree of luxury that Mercedes-Benz represents. Zoom forward another, 1 year, and we said, this problem still exists, but hey, look, we can't solve this because Mercedes has never built a gas station. What do we know about building a charging station? But fast forward again, and about 2.5, 3 years ago, we said, enough is enough. We do have a brand that represents something, and we want to extend that brand promise into the industry, bring together the pieces, and help build what will be the most elevated charging network in North America. And as you said, most importantly, open to every single driver.
So about 2 years since launch, where are we on that journey?
So 2 years since launch, really a year and a half since our first location went in the ground. That first location was in Atlanta at our headquarters in Sandy Springs. Beautiful location, really one of our premium and luxury offerings. Since then, we've continued to build out the network with some really great partners. Buc-ees, which is a fuel stop provider in the Southeast. Simon Mall property is another example. We've built about 400 charging ports, Jason. So 400 cars can charge simultaneously. And the goal here, as you mentioned, is to deploy that $1 billion and build 2,500 of these charging ports across about 250 to 300 locations by the end of 2027.
Okay, so just a couple. You're basically halfway through the journey then, if you take from launch time until completion time. And how are you telling the world that you have these? I mean, obviously in a Mercedes-Benz vehicle, it's apparent, it's built into the software, and I'm guessing the app will alert you to the next Mercedes-Benz charging station. But how do you tell the Chevy Equinox driver?
Yeah, I would say as loud as possible is how we're telling them. Again, this is a challenge not just for the Mercedes-Benz driver, it's a challenge for all vehicles out there. So, I think the easiest way to tell this story is through the Mercedes-Benz microphone, right? And that is one of the benefits yet challenges of building a startup within the big company, which is we have, the three-pointed star that allows us to tell a story beyond the footprint of our network and really leverage some of the work Melody is doing within MBUSA or our German colleagues are doing overseas. So it's really about using all the channels we have, but then it's about meeting the driver where they are, Jason. So some of this is very physical, right? Putting a charging station in someone's hometown and being on their route to drop off their kids, and then some of this is also about meeting drivers in their existing vehicle, so being within infotainment screens or meeting drivers within their favorite app. So we are trying to meet drivers anywhere and everywhere we can, but making it seamless for them to access our network.
This is a pioneering mission for a guy who was more interested in art than he was in cars, or maybe it was art and cars. You tell me. But you've taken an unusual route to the place where you are today. Let's talk about that.
It's a circuitous route. I'm definitely not a traditional car guy by any means. I joke around and say that the first car I bought was actually in my mid-20s, because most of the cars in my family were hand-me-downs. They were station wagons and minivans, but the first car I bought was a 1970 British car, and that's what actually made me fall in love with automotive, was the history and heritage of transportation. But as you said, I was an art student before I was anything else, and I had the opportunity to study in Europe and study some of the masters and some of the classics. And what I take away from that experience was great design is really about great products, right? And that was where I fell in love with this notion of building great products and services is the first principle approach to good business. After that, Jason, I'll say, what got me into, the automotive space was actually bikes. And I was an amateur cyclist, and I raced on the East Coast and on the West Coast. And that time outside gave me an appreciation and an inspiration and awe for nature. So, here's someone who liked to go fast, albeit on two wheels, who had a love for, the climate and environmental issues, and who loved great product. And, in turn, that combination is what led me to Tesla to kind of start my automotive and EV career.
But before we get to Tesla, what were you going to do with the art that you wanted to, or that you were studying? What did that look like at one point?
So it took a couple different paths, but at one point, I called my parents and said, "Mom, Dad, I'm not coming home from Italy. I'm going to become an apprentice and make shoes for the rest of my life."
There we go.
I saw these, these shoe cobblers with, Japanese apprentices learning the trade, learning how to make amazing quality products with that attention to detail. And that was a alternative universe, which in some ways I'm glad did not materialize.
What were you going to work for Ferragamo?
It was actually the small little shop next to the PT Uomo. That was, where I had my eye set. But again, another life.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So then you get to Tesla. Obviously, we don't need to say the impact of that brand or emphasize it. But what was your role there, and what was it that attracted you and had you staying for nearly 5 years?
Yeah, so when I joined Tesla, it was less than a 10,000 person company. If you look at the organization now, it's over 200,000. And when I joined, it was a one car company. Really the Model S just launched, and it was a real drive car. And we were talking about, two motors, and that was the big thing within the Tesla portfolio. I worked across sales operations, finance. And when I left, I was leading global strategy and finance for the charging business. But one thing that stood out to me at Tesla was the fact that if you take a group of people and you surround them with a unifying mission and purpose, you can do amazing things. I think, that was really the genesis for what Tesla was a purpose-driven organization that built amazing product. And really, if you think about it, kind of had the crystal ball for automotive, right? They were telling the future for what everybody is now building today, which was digital, electric, autonomous, and really building towards that delightful customer experience. So, we're all living it and building it today, but Tesla about 10 years ago had that crystal ball.
Boy, at Tesla in 2014, that is indeed the early days. It must have been a sort of a scrappy us against the world mentality, I think.
It was. And I think, in many ways, it's that grit that I think, has sort of
Mm.
carried through. And it's one of the words that I share with my team because I think that's important, right? Especially how we're building the Mercedes-Benz high power charging network. We are a startup within the larger organization. So very different than Tesla in 2014. But, that similar grit is something we need to really be agile in coming up with the right product, coming up with the right consumer offering and listening to the feedback in the market and being agile enough to respond, very much like Tesla did in 2014.
So you go from there, and then it's almost into the charging world at that point. Volta charging? Excuse me. What exactly is that?
Well, I think even before Volta, Jason, I think the through line for me was seeing the big challenges that stood in front of mass EV adoption and where we were at that time. And charging was this fascinating challenge to solve. And I mentioned it before, namely because it was solving both a physical problem, which was how do we build the infrastructure to support the coming wave of vehicles? And the answer was we weren't. And two, how do we solve that emotional problem of really giving people the ability to have freedom of travel back into their daily lives? So we used to say that charging at Tesla was an existential problem to solve. I remember some capital markets guys would ask, is this the right allocation of capital? And the answer was always yes. This is what sells cars. So that's when I kind of got interested in charging as a business and really started to ask myself, what would an industry around charging look like? Because we know there are like comparables out there around fueling. The big oil companies, as an example, are Fortune 50, Fortune 15 companies. So if someone could solve the charging problem all by it on its own, and that's what brought me to Volta, that would be an immense opportunity.
So then Volta, your role there was what?
So when I joined Volta, I was chief of staff to the CEO. It was about a 30-person organization. When I left, we scaled it to about 300, and we took it through a SPAC process at the time, and got caught up in the wave of kind of going public via that framework. But when I left, I was running corporate strategy, business development, and some of the product function.
Give us a little bit now back to high power charging. It is a joint venture with between the subsidiaries of Mercedes-Benz and MN8 Energy. Some might not know MN8 Energy. Give us the lay of the land on MN8.
Yeah, so Mercedes-Benz high power charging, as you rightfully mentioned, is a joint venture. And the reason it's a joint venture is because about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, when we were putting the strategy together at Mercedes to build a class-leading charging network, we said, what are the pieces that you need to be successful? One, you need the brand. You need something that represents the quality and the premium consumer offering. Two is you need the technology. You need someone who really understands the technology of what it means to provide class-leading performance. Three is you need someone who knows how to develop things, put shovels in the ground, build projects. And then four is you need someone who knows how to finance those. Because at the end of the day, charging on one side is a consumer offering business. On the other, it's an infrastructure business. And that's where MN8 comes in. So MN8 Energy is a spin out of Goldman Sachs. And they are a tried and true energy development organization that has built solar, wind, and other clean energy projects, as well as finance them over time. So we brought them on as a partner to really help us build the network and maintain the network as it scales.
You have several other strategic partnerships, one of which you just mentioned a moment ago, and I'll get to Buc-ees. But when we look at Simon and that strategic relationship between HPC, Mercedes-Benz HPC, and Simon, what does Simon do for you in the fact that it is a shopping, dining, and entertainment destination? company. So how does that help what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, I think look, said simply, what you do while you charging can be more important if charging is done well than charging itself. So, amenity matched charging is critical. So when we started to think about, the network we wanted to build and the partners that we wanted to build it with, we wanted to build charging at those locations where people already went and spent time. So Simon Malls is a great example of that, right? If you have, 20 to 25 to 30 minutes where you are charging your vehicle, you have accessible bathrooms, you have, a food court, you have, shopping experiences. So Simon's been a great partner as we think about, the constitution of locations that we want to be part of our portfolio.
And how could that grow in the future?
So Simon Malls is a national chain of mall establishments. So we're just starting with them, right? We put our first or second location in the ground, and we'll be building out across North America with Simon, as well as with Starbucks, as well as with Buc-ees. These are the sort of experiences we want our drivers to have while they're charging their vehicle for that short amount of time.
And let's talk about the Starbucks one. How did that come about? And I mean, the it's obvious the beneficial nature here, but what does that provide the brand?
Well, I think charging is in many ways very similar to coffee, right? If you think about the coffee business, at the end of the day, anybody can sell coffee. Just like anybody can sell charging to some extent. You got to create the business model and the infrastructure around it. But a cup of coffee and an electron, some might say that's a commodity offering. It's really the experiences you build around a great cup of coffee and a great charge, location that define the brand and define the experience. So when we said, where do people spend 15 to 20 to 25 minutes and what is brand commensurate to the Mercedes-Benz offering? Starbucks was a no-brainer. I imagine a world where you're driving your Mercedes from LA to San Francisco, and our AI enabled agent knows exactly your travel pattern and can plug into your Starbucks loyalty account. And when you show up at Starbucks to charge, it has your coffee ready to go. That is an ideal scenario for our driver.
Yeah, that is ideal. I saw some of that at the Consumer Electronics Show a couple of years ago with some of Mercedes-Benz suppliers that indeed using AI for that. Now, the Buc-ee's relationship. Now, Buc-ee's has had a lot of attention for its clean bathrooms and its beef jerky and things of that nature. How does that add to the brand?
It's a funny story. So when we were going through the early commercial negotiations with Buc-ee's, our European colleagues were brought into some of those discussions, and they asked us, they said, who is this Buc-ee's brand? And we, sent them a Google link. We shared with them the website, and they said, Buc-ee's, really? Like, tell us why this is commensurate to the Mercedes-Benz organization. And if you kind of distill it down to its, first principles, at the end of the day, Mercedes cares immensely about its end consumer and building great products and services for their customers. Buc-ee's is a fan favorite within the Southeast. As you said, clean restrooms, great amenities. It is a cult following where even here in New York, I see people wearing the Buc-ee's Beaver logo on the t-shirt. So, for us, it is that great American road trip brought to life through Buc-ee's and the charging amenities that we can place on site. I'll give you an example. Recently I took a road trip with two of my colleagues, and I always tell people that, the best part of that road trip, the best charging experience I had was actually the brisket sandwich I had at Buc-ee's. So that is the sort of, experience that we want to convey through that type of relationship.
And how much could that grow, Andrew? That seems like it has a ton of potential as Buc-ee's grows, Mercedes-Benz grows.
We are building across, almost their whole portfolio. So if you look at, Texas right now, we've built out a substantial number of locations across the Texas Triangle, all with our Buc-ee's partnership. Same with, where you are in, the Southeast and Florida, mostly on the East Coast, to date, but we'll come up the West Coast as well. So that will continue to expand. But an important point here, Jason, is, we aren't, I'd say, anchored to one or two partners to grow our network. We want to have a diversity of experiences for our driver, because at the end of the day, our customer is not just the Mercedes-Benz driver. Actually, 85% of our customers today are non-Mercedes-Benz drivers themselves. So we want to be able to promote an experience that's diverse to meet that diversity of consumers.
Could there be other, as it relates to those partnerships, could there be other perks that we're not even envisioning right now? Could you team up with hotels? Could you team up with, other luxury experiences?
Sure. And I think, Mercedes does that, amazingly already. I was in New York this weekend walking through Soho, and I walked by the Montclair Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon partnership, right? And,
Hmm.
Melody and team, helped kind of bring that to life. So I think Mercedes has never been shy in pushing the envelope around these types of partnerships and these experiences. As it relates to the benefits that accrue to the Mercedes-Benz driver, one of the things we've set up with the Mercedes-Benz high power charging network is creating unique features and benefits for the Mercedes-Benz driver. At the end of the day, we are a Mercedes-Benz network. We are going to provide charging for all drivers, but we do want to save something special for the Mercedes-Benz driver. So one example of that, Jason, is we've created a reservation system. So as you're driving, you can actually, like a flight controller, have a charging stall reserved for you as you approach that location to make sure that you always have some access to our network and don't have to wait in some queue.
Hmm. Nice. Let's talk about what's out there right now, other than the Mercedes-Benz charging network. I know that the numbers, although there's been a lot of talk of what could happen to EV sales, EV penetration continues to soar with the number of new cars sold. And it is still outpacing the number of fast chargers, correct?
It is. I mean, if you look at the numbers, EV sales are increasing at a continuous growth rate higher than charging today. I think that's exacerbated, Jason, by the fact that, 1 in 4 chargers are not working the way they should. So even if we didn't build to, meet demand, which, we need to, we still have a fleet or charging network out there that isn't working to the level of quality that drivers expect it to.
And overcoming those obstacles are exactly what you have in mind. I mean, we all have our stories, and it's the broken ones, and it's the ones where there's no accessibility, or just simply the footprint doesn't allow you to drive very far. What's the end state here, Andrew? Do you get to a point where you are dotting the landscape every X number of miles so that any and all of those anxieties go away?
It's an interesting question. At the end of the day, the answer is no. You don't need charging ubiquity literally everywhere because, at some point, battery technology will continue to improve. You will be able to, get around your hometown, without having to charge except for at night when you plug in. Or, you'll need, a charger every, 100 miles, but you don't need it every 25 miles if you're on a long, road trip. At the end of the day, our goal here is simple. It is to elevate the charging experience. So we still see a long way to go there for the industry. I mean, that's everything around quality, Jason. So when you show up, it works. We call it uptime. Right now, our network is 99% uptime. So when you show up, it works 99% of the time. And that 1% is something that we're working through with firmware and hardware and all the other kind of, combinations in between, as well as it's accessible, as well as there's a level of performance behind the network that the driver expects. So I think, there is some wood to chop around the standards of charging that will take us a few years down the road. And then beyond that, the end state here again is, charging. For me, I call it, the grandparent test. Charging is so easy that someone with zero experience in charging, zero experience in technology can essentially show up, plug in, walk away, and have a great experience, whatever they want to be doing, whether, they're walking away to spend time with their family, have a cup of coffee, go to work, be at home, whatever that experience is, charging works every single time.
And a lot of headlines around how long it takes to charge.
Yeah.
And while most mainstream EVs take anywhere from 15 to 40 minutes to charge, lo and behold, BYD comes out recently and says, well, now we have vehicles that will accept 1,000 kilowatts of charging power, about 4 times more than a typical Tesla. And the charge time will be as low as 5 minutes for 250 miles. Right? Game changer?
To some extent, yes. To some extent, yes, but I do want to explain this one because I think it's important, which is to say, 1,000 kilowatt charging, which is kind of, industry jargon, essentially very fast charging
Yep.
has always existed all by on one side of that handshake. So it takes, two sides of a handshake to make charging work. BYD's announcement was car and charger now can have that complete handshake. On the charging side, we've always been able to deliver a lot of power. On the vehicle side, to your point, the breakthrough, Jason, was such that the battery technology and the voltage architecture within the vehicle now can actually accept that charger. What's important to also mention, though, is Ola, our CEO, just a couple of weeks ago announcing our new CLA platform, which is an 800 voltage architecture. So maybe not 5 minutes of charging time to what BYD is mentioning, but that CLA product will charge within 10 to 12 minutes. So I think the question here is, how quick do you actually need to charge? And I go back to, the fueling analogy, which, it takes about 10 to 12 minutes to actually fuel your vehicle, which is about the time it takes to, walk in and use the restroom, wrangle the kids, get out and stretch your legs. So I think, 5 minutes is amazing, Jason. But at the end of the day, at some point, there's diminishing returns because we as humans still have basic amenities and services that we need whenever we stop our vehicle.
It's important for people to understand, though, that generally that this is not a prolonged experience anymore, right? Which has been the big barrier.
Correct.
And unless I'm going to a movie, right, then I really don't need to charge it for that long.
Yeah. Well, I think you're hitting on a really interesting point about charging. And, in another world, I should probably kind of like go down the therapy or, psychology route because, people talk about the social psychology and the range anxiety that exists around charging because the actual problem is bigger than the reality of the issue. And I think to your point, you're hitting sort of the nail on the head, which is people just want faster because it's what is, marketable and it's what sells. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to accomplish here with Mercedes-Benz high power charging is creating the right experience and attenuating that experience to what someone does at that location. So as much as we want to dial up speed and dial up power, we fundamentally want to dial down inconvenience.
Mm-hmm. I'm of the opinion that electrification will get here in stages. It was never going to be a light switch that was going to flip on or flip off. When you look at your own crystal ball 10 years down the road, what does the EV landscape look like to you?
Yeah, I think
generally.
I think you hit the nail on the head, which is, 5 years ago, I think we all thought this transition would happen sooner than it did. Today, we're letting the consumer drive that transition a lot more. At Mercedes-Benz, we call it, flexibility of choice or, the luxury of choice and really thinking about how do we offer an amazing product, an amazing service in a similar design footprint where you can pick your powertrain, right? Whether it's an electric vehicle, whether it's a gas vehicle, whether it's a hybrid vehicle. I still believe the future is electric. If you think about the product architecture, these are higher performative vehicles, lower maintenance costs. There's a lot of benefits that accrue around electric vehicles. But I think, Jason, to your point, we've got to let the consumer drive that adoption and drive whatever that transition looks like, because it really depends on their own specific use case. How are they using that vehicle? What is their education on electric vehicles and new technology? So I think it's going to be mixed, and I think it will be mixed for a long time. And I think that's okay. We just got to help support those people who are interested in electric, interested in hybrid along on that journey.
When I interviewed Elon Musk 10 years ago, he wanted the whole world to be on this pathway to electrification. And lo and behold, 10 years later, we're having these conversations on a more regular basis. Is there still more room to go in the general conversation of electrification, or does it get, or are we reaching a more critical mass, I guess?
I mean, look, if you look at the past years, and let's go back to Tesla, because, early on, they were really the only show in town, right? The Model S was one of the first electric vehicles mass produced in market. And you could say there are other ones as well, but in terms of, mass appeal, mass marketing, that was one of the more attractive options at the time. You fast forward now, 10, 15 years, and you look at the fleet on the road today, and you'll have this opportunity next week. It sounds like, Jason, at, the Auto Week here in New York, to really see a number of different options coming out from Ford, GM, Mercedes, and the mix of the fleet in terms of EVs to gas to hybrid is significantly larger. So I actually think that we are in a pretty good place here in terms of offerings for the consumer. And again, now it's letting the consumer drive that transition and drive that, kind of evolution over time.
Are there things to learn from other parts of the world? Can you borrow some of what you're maybe seeing in the Nordic countries?
Yeah, I think there's two places. One, I'll go back to China. I mean, BYD's breakthrough on charging is just one of the announcements that has come out over the last, weeks, Jason. I think, if you looked at, their announcement on new car sales compared to Tesla, they've now surpassed Tesla in terms of EV sold globally. So I think, the lesson learned there for me, and I think for the automotive industry, is we can't let up on the investment, right? I think we're in a really unique position right now from a macroeconomic perspective, high interest rates, a lot of these global, trade conversations. But at the end of the day, we have to find a way to balance that with the requisite investments in the future. And China and their innovation and their future technology today is a proof point for that. I think your point on the Nordic countries, being able to create infrastructure at the scale that they have and really remove some of those barriers for EV adoption concerns, that's essentially the future of where we're going in America, right? There are two major concerns around EVs today. One is infrastructure and the other is affordability. So if we can solve those two challenges, then from an adoption perspective and a percentage of fleet, we can get to where the Nordic countries are within the US.
And I know a goal of Mercedes-Benz, obviously, with this initiative is to build the best system in North America, but that doesn't help if it's too expensive. And I'm sure a big part of what you're trying to manage here is around the cost competitiveness. How do you handle that when demand charges from utilities can be very high?
It's a good question. And I think, as an organization, Mercedes-Benz has really looked to create, a leadership position around quality and experience and set that standard. We've never been in the market to create, the low cost offering. It's just never been our strategy. As it relates to the charging industry, pricing is something that actually for us is equitable across all networks. So we offer right now, a welcome price at our new stations that we're putting in the ground of 40 cents per kilowatt hour, which is actually lower than most charging stations out there, while still offering a premium experience compared to some of our competitors. I think your question on, demand costs and managing, some of the, cost components of our business model are something that requires planning and stakeholder management. Our business is such that utilities, local governments, construction firms, all of these individuals are a key component to whether or not we'll be successful over the long term.
And I think bottom line, you're looking to solve the chicken and the egg formula, aren't you?
We are. We are. I mean, again, I think the fundamentals of charging are, we need to put charging in the ground at a level of quality and experience such that we can support EV adoption. I mean, that is our goal. I always say that, I joined Mercedes-Benz because, there's this history and legacy of being the first and the standards we've created over time. And now as we think about the future, being, humbly able to help out on some of these, large standing challenges to move the industry forward, that's the goal. That's what we're trying to solve.
And what's next for you? What's next for you in this journey here? Where do you want to be a year or two from now?
Mercedes-Benz is a household name. Mercedes-Benz charging is not. So I think, simply said, we want to make sure that every driver out there knows who we are and has access to one of our charging stations. That's number one. Number two is, we want to make good on our promise to set the industry standard around quality. So, that confidence that you can show up and it works every single time. And then we want to start working towards those experiences, that kind of future scenario that I laid out for you before, Jason, of being able to, pre-order your cup of coffee and have it, embedded into your AI, assistant. Those are the things that I think will really be, kind of the icing on the cake as we build out charging infrastructure and the experiences around it.
Coming to a Starbucks, a Buc-ee's, any other location near you, it'll be all the result of what Andrew has to do. Thank you so much for being on the program, for giving us the lay of the land on EVs, and for taking a detour off your art path to take on this automotive mission. You, much like the masters you studied, you are your own pioneer, Andrew.
Jason, thank you for the time, and good luck with everything.
Thank you.